I'm here today not to talk about technology so much or languages, but optimizing for developer happiness and the way that we do it at Etsy. How many of you, is anyone in the audience Etsy seller? Awesome. Who has bought something from Etsy? Even better. Well, thank all of you. Thank you, sellers and buyers. So at Etsy, we deploy code to production about 25 times per day. And this is across a team of 70 engineers. I said I wasn't going to talk about technology, but this fits into happiness. We have a lot of people depending on us, many of you in the room. We have over 400,000 active sellers on Etsy. We have over 9 million registered members. We had over $300 million in sales across the community in 2010. Right now, just last month, we did about $40 million in sales, so it's still growing. And we do over 1 billion page views a month. So a lot of people depend on us to do our work and do it well. And in over 150 countries also. So how do we do it? The way we do it primarily, aside from all the technology, is all cultural and about culture. And that culture is one that optimizes for developer happiness. Eric Kastner, who some of you may know, is the first person on my team who actually talked about developer happiness as something that we should optimize for. And so we've been building on that. I think everyone in this room, by the nature of the way Ruby was designed, has a feel for what it means for developer happiness to be important. So what we do at Etsy is we do a lot of things, have a lot of institutions in place to really connect engineers to their work. I think what Glenn was saying about craftsmanship is really about connection, so we emphasize that. We do it by making it really easy to ship software, to get it out to the people who use Etsy, and we do that with the support of a community, the community inside the company and the community outside the company. Are you guys able to see these? Okay, good. I think maybe we're cut off just a little bit. So Noah Sussman, who runs the testing team on Etsy, said that Etsy runs as a chaotic community that's irreverent and self-sustaining with all sorts of different mechanisms to make it work. The way we do things at Etsy with 25 times a day, 70 engineers, actually shouldn't work. There's actually no reason it should work. There's no book that you could buy saying this is the way you should do it, but it actually does work. What we do is we emphasize constant progress on the team, shipping frequently, and that's powered by a really radical decentralization of authority, which really means we actually trust people. The way we're able to ship 25 times a day with 70 engineers is because we trust the people on the team. We also trust dogs. If you read our jobs page, you'll see that every job description says that dogs are part of the team and are expected to commit code. So Dottie and Milo have both committed code and have both deployed code, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Two-button mouse works pretty well with a paw. So we have a one-button deploy at Etsy. With this button, and there's some fanfare before you get to this button, but with this button, when you press this button, your code goes out to the millions and millions of Etsy members immediately, which is a really great thing. So basically, anyone you see when you're walking around Etsy who's an engineer can deploy code, and here are some of the engineers deploying that code. And you can see it's a very colorful office, very inspirational. Product managers can deploy code at Etsy. We hire product managers who are technical. So Leland, who just joined us recently to run our mobile efforts, deployed code on his first day. He marked up the HTML to put his own photo on the About page, and he actually deployed the code. We've even had board members deploy code. We had a board meeting a couple months ago, and Fred Wilson on our board was walking out, and I said, "Hey, Fred, do you want to deploy Etsy?" And he looked, I don't think anyone's ever asked him that before. But he smiled and said, "Sure." And I think you can see in the back, Adam Freed, our COO, is so bored with the idea of a deploy that he's checking his BlackBerry. So we've made it really simple to deploy code at Etsy. to the point that we're comfortable with board members. Fred actually deployed code related to checkout, which when I asked him to deploy, I wasn't quite aware of, but it all turned out really well. So this is Milo deploying code. His paw is being guided to the mouse, as you can see. But Milo, just like any other engineer at Etsy, watches what's going on the screen. You can see the code being synced out to the servers. There's a progress bar, and you can see him looking expectantly, making sure that the code deploy went okay, and it did. And then now, just like Leland before him, Milo was able to deploy his photo to our staff page, which made Milo happy. You can see that sort of dog smile on his face. Those of you with dogs know what the dog smile is. I was really excited listening to Glenn's talk about craft, because at Etsy, we have an engineering blog that we call Code is Craft. So if you read the About page on our blog, we talk about that craftsmen sign their work. And you see this is mentioned, I think, in the Pragmatic Programmer. And our engineering blog is the way that engineers at Etsy sign their work. It's a way that we give engineers a voice. So those of you who sell on Etsy or buy things on Etsy know that the members of Etsy, the people who make things on Etsy, they use things like wool and cloth and metal and all sorts of things to make things to sell on Etsy. And again, there are over 400,000 people selling on Etsy. At Etsy, the way we think about it is we use Max, we use TextMate, we use VI, some insane people use Emacs, and sometimes, we play guitar while we're actually doing code, which you'll see. One guy coding, one guy accompanying on guitar. Makes it all the more nicer. And this is, by the way, what our office actually looks like. Sometimes I forget there's like a pastoral scene of deer on the wall. So Bill Massey, an engineer on my team, wrote to me and said this is one of the reasons that he loves Etsy. And he said that Etsy respects the trade of engineering, and what he feels, and again, in terms of optimizing for engineering happiness, when he first came to Etsy, there was a big banner that said, "We love engineers." And you can feel it in the environment that we do love engineers, and that's really meaningful for the people at Etsy. And this is the banner, a handmade banner. So that isn't the case necessarily in many companies. And it's one of the great frustrations for me that that we have Dilbert. Like, we laugh at Dilbert. Dilbert is actually funny. There's no doubt about that. Dilbert has been running for 22 years. There's enough material to keep Dilbert going for 22 years, and it drives me insane. Like, everything I do at Etsy, I don't want to ever look like Dilbert. So in this particular Dilbert cartoon, you see the pointy-haired boss basically saying Dilbert saying we're going to use Agile, and pointy-haired boss says, find me a method that just gets more with less, that gets more productivity from people. So this has a long history in industry. And as I was listening to Glenn talk about industrial engineering, I was really excited. I hadn't seen this presentation before, because I had been watching Charlie Chaplin in Modern Times, which was, I think, probably the greatest satire on life in a factory, which was released 75 years ago. And I think it shows sort of the Dilbert mentality applied to factory work, or perhaps Dilbert stole from Chaplin, which is more like it. The way Charlie Chaplin describes this in literally the first frames of the movie, he says that Modern Times is a story of industry, of individual enterprise, and humanity crusading in the pursuit of happiness, which I think describes really all of our lives here. Everyone is part of humanity crusading in the pursuit of happiness. It doesn't go so well for Chaplin. He's on an assembly line, and he's moving as fast as he can with the assembly line, and he's got a foreman who's sort of browbeating him and saying, faster, faster, faster. And eventually he gets behind. He gets so behind that he literally gets sucked into the machine, into the gears, and he's like trying to use his wrenches to sort of get out of it. I think the reason I was thinking about this, I think there's still many places in our industry and in our work where software is viewed as factory work. And we at Etsy just don't see it that way, so we don't design our environment in a way that promotes the idea of it as factory work. So the most absurd scene in modern times, I think, is when Chaplin's boss, who is, the pointy-haired boss's grandfather, I think, entertained some salesmen who are visiting, and they are trying to sell him the Billings feeding machine. And the idea for the Billings feeding machine is that you can still be on the factory line. So underneath, in this view here, underneath the table are Chaplin's hands. He's still on the assembly line, but what the Billings feeding machine does is it feeds you so that you don't have to take lunch. So this plate rotates, and these morsels of food are literally pushed into his mouth. And the idea, the sales pitch was literally eliminate the lunch hour and give yourself, a better competitive edge. So I was thinking, wow, this is really dehumanizing. So eating is such a human activity. I mean, we all have to do it every day. There are some days where you don't get a chance because you're working really hard, without a doubt. But in Chaplin's world, this sort of horrific world, he doesn't even get the human pleasure of eating with his coworkers. He's literally on the line eating with the Billings feeding machine. What we've done at Etsy is we actually have a communal lunch every Tuesday and Thursday that we call Eatsy. Amazingly, it took a long time to come up with the name. It was brainstorming, like, what do we call this? And then Eatsy. Oh, okay. And so what we've done with Eatsy, you can see members of our support team, our editorial team, engineers, we actually get together and sit around a large table, even with a 200-person company, many large tables. We actually talk to each other, because eating together is about happiness. So unlike Chaplin and his factory, we've actually optimized the lunch hour for happiness, not just for developer happiness, but for company happiness. We'll go back to the assembly line for just a moment. And so what is it about the assembly line that is so sort of dehumanizing? So for here, I turn to Peter Drucker. Peter Drucker is widely known as one of the greatest sort of business thinkers ever in the history of the world, and in some ways has defined what management is about, and I find him to be really fascinating. So he wrote a book published in 1946 called Concept of the Corporation, and it was really the first book that ever looked at a company as a set of human relations and kind of the human factors inside a company. And what Drucker said about the assembly line is the problem with the assembly line wasn't monotony. It was the confinement of the worker to one manipulation repeated endlessly, which denies the satisfaction of finishing a job. So it was all about not having the satisfaction of finishing. So in essence, when you take it in software terms, when you work on an assembly line, you're not really allowed to ship. You're making things, you're putting on a widget, but you never get to see the finished product. So Drucker tells a story of a factory just after World War II where there were workers on an assembly line working on airplanes, and they were all working on particular parts, like some people working on the engines, some people working on the wings. And what happened in this factory is that management was complaining that the workers were really kind of listless and unproductive, and there was a high degree of absenteeism, there were work slowdowns and stoppages. And a manager had an insight where he said, maybe these people are feeling this way and acting this way because they don't actually get to see the finished product. So what they did, the managers invited the workers and their families out to an airfield where they had several planes set up, and each plane had a crew member in it, and they let the workers and encouraged the workers to kind of crawl in the planes and look around, and the crew members inside the planes who were flying the planes would ask the workers, what part are you working on? And the crew members would explain to the worker how that particular part fit into the plane, help them conduct a safe flight, help them get their business done. So immediately, as Drucker tells the story, like right after this happened, worker productivity went way up, absenteeism went way down. The workers were able to see what they were building and actually ship. So no more were they working on widgets, they were actually shipping airplanes. Dan Ariely, who wrote another book called Predictably Irrational, which is a great read, also just published a book called The Upside of Irrationality, and he ran a bunch of behavioral tests. And what he came out with was that allowing employees to feel a sense of completion and ensuring that the job was well done is what creates meaning in work. So getting back to what we do at Etsy, these easy deploys, as developers, it's like they're no longer making widgets on the assembly line. They're actually seeing airplanes. So back to the button. When you press this button at Etsy, I'm sure many of you have similar one-button deploys. You actually get to see the website immediately. You get to see what you've made. You get to see the airplane that you're making. Even better, back to the concept of community, and I'm sure those of you who run sites with really active communities, we get instant feedback from the community. So not only are you getting the gratification of a job completed, you're actually getting feedback. You're getting feedback from the crew members who are telling you how your work fits into their lives. That creates intense developer happiness. You get comments like, "This has been a dream. Thank you so much." From pressing that button to getting praise from someone using your product is extremely gratifying. So at Etsy, this whole cycle from committing code actually, when you commit code to trunk, and we work on trunk all the time, which is probably the subject of another talk, this whole cycle from committing to trunk and having code live on the site that the community can comment on, it takes 21 minutes. So as a developer, again, with this decentralized authority, which I'll talk about more in just a minute, 21 minutes, and you're in flight. So back to Drucker. Another thing that Drucker said in concept of the corporation is that the corporation's social function as a community is as important as its economic function as an efficient producer. So it's really interesting to me. Drucker is one of the fathers of management thought, would say something like this. But if you watch CNBC or read the Wall Street Journal, no one talks about companies as communities. But at Etsy, we think of the company as a community. Back to the button. This button is a water cooler. It's a thing that people gather around. It's something that they talk around. It's like the keg in the backyard at a summer party. It's a focal point. We gather around it about 25 times a day. We use IRC heavily. I'm sure, like, how many of you are using IRC in your company's startups? Many. So IRC is really unremarkable. It's been around forever. But I think what we're doing with IRC at Etsy is really remarkable, given the size of the team. We have something we call the push train. So you may be thinking, if you have 70 engineers, you're always committing to trunk, and you're pushing 25 times a day. Like, how do you do that? So Ross Snyder, one of our engineers, came up with the idea of the push train. And it's really, very simply, one of the mechanisms that makes it work is the changing of an IRC topic. So when you want to get in line to push, you basically change the IRC topic and put your name at the end of it. And then you are sanctioned to push. So that's not incredibly remarkable, but I think how it works is more remarkable. So the way the push train works is like it's an airport without an air traffic controller where the planes line up on the runway and the pilots communicate amongst themselves. So Steve in this line was the first to take off. As soon as he gets to a comfortable cruising altitude, he radios back to Mike, who's number 2, and says, "Mike, you're clear to take off." Then Mike gets in position, and says, "Rachel, I'm about to take off." Rachel's behind him. Then Rachel waits for Mike to get to cruising altitude. Mike says, I'm clear, and then Rachel takes off. This repeats itself 25 times a day at Etsy, several hundred times a month, and there's no centralized release manager. This is the way it works all the time. So I read a quote recently that I thought really described the beauty of how this works. And the quote that it was describing something else, an intricate ballet in which the individual dancers and ensembles all have distinctive parts which miraculously reinforce each other and compose an orderly whole. The person who wrote this was actually Jane Jacobs, who wrote the definitive book about urban planning, one of the definitive books in a classic called The Death and Life of Great American Cities. And what she was writing about when she wrote about the intricate ballet and the ensembles and how this chaos comes to an orderly whole, she was writing about cities. She was largely writing about New York City. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. She was really writing about community and how this ballet makes communities work, decentralized communities. So Justin Donato, a new software engineer he started a month ago, actually wrote to me about our IRC and communication channels. He referred to them as entertaining as well as useful, and that it made newcomers like Justin feel comfortable and supported. This is the language of communities and neighborhoods, not the language of code pushes and IRC. So really, we use tools to build happy communities at Etsy, the Etsy community and the community of engineers inside Etsy. One thing that Jane Jacobs said about successful communities and neighborhoods is that there's an unconscious assumption of general street support when the chips are down. And anyone who runs a website here knows that sometimes the chips are down. Sometimes the site is down. It happens. Something that Mike Britton, one of our software engineers, said to me, and as far as I know, Mike hasn't read Jane Jacobs, but what he said echoed Jane Jacobs to me. He said the thing that he loved about Etsy, the thing that made him happy at Etsy, was that there's so many engineers watching each other's back. So again, engineers are happy. It's like Jane Jacobs' successful neighborhoods and successful communities. So really, a lot of what we talk about when we talk about management and software and managing a team and leading a team and directing a team, the word executive, about execution, we're talking about, we're using a certain kind of language. But the way I think about my team is that the team itself is a community. Much like Drucker said that corporations are communities, my team is a community. The best thing I can do is to create an environment where we help them finish things, where we help them see the airplanes they're building, not just the widgets, where we give people the tools to be able to ship in 20 minutes and actually interact with the community on the site. It's important to give them a voice. The thing that excites me about the push train and that decentralized way of working is that that's evidence of the team speaking to each other and working out a system that actually works. So Jane Jacobs wrote something about something about order and chaos in the book, The Death and Life of Great American Cities. She said, there is a quality even meaner than outright ugliness or disorder, and this meaner quality is the dishonest mask of pretended order, achieved by ignoring or suppressing the real order that is struggling to exist and be served. I'm sure many of the companies you work for have this sort of pretended order. Pretended order is, we do releases like this, but all the engineers know that it's going to break and you're going to have to push 1,000,000 times that day anyway. That kind of thing, I think, demotivates people. The real order is the way people actually do their work. So in closing, I would say in your companies, in your teams, in open source communities, build a community where you allow the real human order to get things done, completion being important, and great things will happen. The team will gel, you'll build a great product. So in closing, optimize your teams for the happiness of people. And thank you.